Welcome to today's episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I am your host, Arthur Morgan. What I'm about to share with you is one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about childhood trauma, mental illness, and the darkest capabilities of the human mind. This is the story of Joseph Kallinger, a man whose life began in abandonment and abuse, and ended in a prison cell after committing unspeakable acts of violence. But perhaps what makes this case truly unforgettable is this: he didn't commit his crimes alone. He brought his own 13-year-old son along for the ride. I'm warning you now, this episode contains descriptions of extreme abuse, violence, and disturbing criminal acts. But I believe it's important we talk about cases like these because they reveal something crucial about how childhood trauma can warp a human being beyond recognition. So, let's dive in. Our story begins on December 11, 1935, in Philadelphia, where a baby boy was born and given the name Joseph Lee Brenner III. But this child would never know his biological father. Shortly after Joseph's birth, his father abandoned the family completely, vanishing from their lives and leaving his mother in an impossible situation. She was alone, overwhelmed, and unable to care for an infant by herself. By December 1937, when Joseph was just 2 years old, his mother made a devastating decision. She placed him into foster care. Imagine being that young and already experiencing your first major rejection. This early separation from his biological family wasn't just a temporary setback. It set the tone for a childhood that would be defined by neglect, pain, and suffering. For 2 years, Joseph existed in the foster care system, a small child without a permanent home, without stability, without the love and security every child desperately needs. But in October 1939, something happened that must have seemed like a miracle at the time. A couple, Austrian immigrants named Stephen and Anna Kallinger, decided to adopt 4-year-old Joseph. Finally, it seemed, this boy would have a real family, a real home. Finally, he would be safe. Except he wouldn't be safe at all. In fact, the nightmare was just beginning. What happened behind the closed doors of the Kallinger home is almost too horrific to comprehend. Anna Kallinger, Joseph's adoptive mother, was not the nurturing, protective figure a child needs. She was controlling, cruel, and sadistic, a woman who seemed to take actual pleasure in causing her adopted son pain. The punishments Anna inflicted on young Joseph were medieval in their brutality. Picture this: a small child forced to kneel on jagged rocks for hours, his knees bleeding and raw. While his adoptive mother watched with cold satisfaction, Joseph was regularly locked inside dark closets for extended periods, left alone in the darkness with his fear and confusion. He was starved as punishment. He was burned with hot irons. He was whipped with belts until his skin broke open. But perhaps the most disturbing detail? Anna forced this child to ingest excrement. Let that sink in for a moment. These weren't just punishments. They were calculated acts designed to break his spirit, to destroy any sense of dignity or self-worth he might have had. Anna wanted total control, and she achieved it through systematic torture. When Joseph was just 6 years old, his adoptive father, Stephen, beat him so severely that the child developed a hernia. A hernia, at 6 years old, from a beating. This wasn't discipline. This was dangerous, potentially lethal violence inflicted on a helpless child. And Anna's abuse wasn't just physical. She dominated Joseph emotionally, psychologically. She instilled in him a bone-deep terror that would follow him into adulthood years later. When Joseph was arrested for his crimes as an adult, do you know what he said was his greatest fear? Not prison, not the death penalty. He said his greatest fear was that his mother would find out about his arrest. Even as a grown man, Even as a violent criminal himself, he was still terrified of Anna Kallinger. That's the psychological grip she had on him. The abuse continued relentlessly throughout his childhood. Joseph grew up in an environment completely devoid of affection, safety, or love. He never experienced the normal joys of childhood. Instead, he was emotionally isolated, unable to form healthy attachments or learn how to regulate his emotions in healthy ways. As if the abuse at home wasn't enough, Joseph suffered yet another devastating trauma around the age of 9. Neighborhood boys sexually assaulted him. This additional violation further destroyed his sense of safety and trust. For a child already living in a nightmare at home, this assault shattered whatever remaining fragments of security he might have felt in the outside world. Think about what Joseph's psychological state must have been at this point. He's being brutally abused by the very people who are supposed to protect him. He's being sexually violated by peers. He's emotionally isolated with no one to turn to, no safe adults in his life, no escape from the constant pain. His entire world is violence, control, fear, and suffering. Research into serial killers has identified common patterns in their backgrounds, and Joseph Kallinger's childhood fits these patterns almost perfectly. Many violent offenders share similar histories: abusive, controlling mothers who dominate them psychologically, absent or violent father figures who provide no protection or positive male role modeling, broken family structures that fail to provide stability or nurture. Experts who've studied Kallinger's case have pointed out that Anna's behavior mirrors the harsh, controlling mothers found in the backgrounds of numerous violent criminals. This isn't to say that abusive childhoods automatically create killers. Of course they don't. Many people survive terrible childhoods and never harm anyone. But the research shows that these early experiences can damage emotional development in ways that make violence more likely. Children raised in such brutal conditions often develop deep-seated fears, overwhelming anger, and severe difficulty managing their emotions. The constant abuse and neglect Joseph experienced didn't just hurt him in the moment, it rewired his developing brain, damaged his ability to form healthy attachments, and robbed him of crucial emotional skills that most of us take for granted. The repeated trauma left psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Joseph Kallinger never had a chance at a normal childhood. He was denied love, safety, and emotional support. Instead, he learned that the world was cruel, that people in power will hurt you, that violence is how you exert control. These were the lessons his adoptive parents taught him, day after day, year after year. Now let's jump forward in time. Joseph Kallinger grew up, escaped his abusive home, and started his own family. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because Joseph didn't break the cycle of abuse, he perpetuated it. His own household became marked by fear, violence, and trauma, just like the one he'd grown up in. Joseph had a son named Michael. And when Michael reached his early teenage years, something truly disturbing happened. Joseph began recruiting his own 13-year-old child to help him commit crimes, not petty theft, not vandalism. We're talking about murders, violent assaults, sexual abuse, torture, and armed robbery. Let's pause and think about the psychology here. Michael had grown up in an extremely abusive and chaotic home with Joseph as his father. The household was filled with the same fear and violence that had defined Joseph's own childhood. Michael was no exception to the abuse. He was subjected to his father's rage and control, just like everyone else in the family. Psychologists who've studied this case explain that children who grow up in such abusive environments are incredibly vulnerable. They can become victims themselves, which Michael certainly was, but they can also be manipulated into participating in crimes. In Michael's case, his father's psychological dominance was so complete, so overwhelming, that this 13-year-old child ended up helping Joseph commit horrific acts. Think about Michael's position. He's a young teenager. His brain isn't fully developed. He lacks the emotional and mental maturity to fully understand the consequences of actions or to effectively resist an adult authority figure, especially one as controlling and frightening as his father. Joseph used manipulation and intimidation to force Michael's compliance. He threatened his son. He used fear as a weapon. In some cases, Michael was forced to witness violence, and in others, he was made to participate directly. Michael's involvement wasn't about choice. It was the result of years of psychological domination, fear, and trauma. He was both a perpetrator and a victim, caught in a terrifying, twisted relationship with a father who was both a killer and a controlling figure. This dual nature makes Michael's situation heartbreakingly complex. Between late 1974 and early 1975, Joseph Kallinger and his 13-year-old son Michael went on one of the most brutal crime sprees in American history. Over just a few months, they terrorized communities across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, leaving a trail of traumatized victims and destroyed lives. But before we discuss the specific crimes, we need to understand Joseph's mental state at this time. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that caused him to experience hallucinations and delusions. Joseph heard voices. He saw things that weren't there. And most significantly, he believed he was on a divine mission, carrying out God's will. This delusion gave him a sense of power and righteousness that fueled his sadistic violence. It made him feel justified in the terrible things he was doing. Joseph even had a name for one of his hallucinations, Charlie, a disembodied head that spoke to him and gave him instructions. This wasn't just an excuse or a lie to avoid responsibility. Joseph genuinely experienced these symptoms. His mental illness made him dangerous and completely unpredictable. The crimes themselves followed a terrifying pattern. Joseph and Michael would conduct home invasions, usually breaking in at night when families felt most vulnerable. They would burst in, often armed with knives and guns, demanding money and valuables. But these weren't ordinary robberies. Joseph didn't just want to steal. He wanted to torture and humiliate his victims. He used knives, guns, pliers, and other tools to inflict pain. He forced victims to comply under constant threat of death. Families were tied up and held hostage for hours, forced to endure not just the robbery, but systematic physical and emotional abuse. Joseph seemed to take genuine pleasure in their suffering. Sexual assault was a horrifying component of these crimes. Joseph sexually abused several victims, including both women and children, using sexual violence as another way to assert dominance and control. Some victims were forced to witness these assaults or were threatened with similar treatment, adding another layer of psychological torture to their ordeal. Let me tell you about some of the specific victims, because these weren't just statistics. They were real people whose lives were forever changed by Joseph Kallinger. In Pennsylvania, Shirley Reichert and her daughter Suzanne survived a violent home invasion where Joseph and Michael broke into their home, tied them up, and tortured them for hours. Imagine the terror, being bound and helpless while a violent man and his young son inflict pain on you, not knowing if you'll survive the night. Both women survived, but the psychological scars from that experience would last forever. In New Jersey, a man named Edward DeSantis was attacked in his own home and left with severe injuries. He thought he was safe in his house, and suddenly violence crashed through his door without warning. But the most tragic victim was 16-year-old Linda Mueller in Pennsylvania. Linda didn't survive her encounter with the Kallingers. She was sexually assaulted and murdered during one of their break-ins. A teenage girl with her whole life ahead of her, killed by a delusional man and his controlled son. Her murder represents the ultimate tragedy of this case. Joseph's torture methods were especially cruel and sadistic. He reportedly used pliers to pinch and tear victims' flesh. He beat people severely, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with his fists. In at least one documented case, he forced a victim to eat excrement, the same degrading act his adoptive mother had forced on him as a child. The cycle of abuse had come full circle. The psychological damage to survivors was profound and long-lasting. Many suffered from severe PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares. They couldn't feel safe in their own homes anymore. Some never fully recovered from the trauma of what Joseph Kallinger had done to them. Initially, law enforcement struggled to connect these crimes. The attacks happened across multiple states: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The details varied. The randomness of victim selection made it difficult to see a pattern. But gradually, as more cases were reported and investigated, police began to see the connections. The crime spree finally ended in March 1975. After months of investigation, law enforcement agencies managed to link Joseph and Michael Kallinger to multiple crime scenes. The breakthrough came when police tracked down a vehicle connected to one of the attacks. They questioned neighbors and witnesses, slowly building a case until they had enough evidence to make arrests. When authorities came for them, Joseph didn't resist. He was cooperative to some extent. Though his behavior clearly showed signs of his severe mental illness, Michael was also taken into custody. A frightened, controlled child who had been deeply influenced and manipulated by his father. The trial began in late 1975 and immediately attracted massive national media attention. The courtroom proceedings were intense and disturbing. Prosecutors presented graphic, detailed accounts of the violence, the torture, the sexual assaults, the murder. They had forensic evidence, they had survivor testimonies. And these testimonies were powerful, horrifying, and impossible to ignore. Joseph Kallinger's defense team faced an uphill battle. Their strategy centered on his mental illness. They argued that his paranoid schizophrenia made him not fully responsible for his actions. They pointed to his hallucinations and delusions, arguing that these symptoms influenced his behavior so profoundly that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong during the crime spree. It was a compelling argument in some ways. Joseph genuinely was mentally ill. He genuinely did hear voices and experience delusions. But the prosecution countered effectively. They demonstrated that despite his mental illness, Kallinger was aware enough to understand the nature of his crimes. Many of his violent acts showed clear planning and premeditation. His sadistic tendencies and the calculated way he involved his son in the crime suggested someone who knew exactly what he was doing, mental illness or not. The court ultimately agreed with the prosecution. They found that while Joseph was mentally ill, he still understood right from wrong and could be held legally responsible for his actions. Michael's situation was more complicated. The court recognized that he was a minor, only 13 years old during the crimes. They acknowledged that he was likely under his father's psychological control, but he was still charged with participation in violent acts, including involvement in murders. The legal system had to grapple with a difficult question. How do you handle a child offender who is simultaneously a victim of severe abuse and manipulation? Michael received a different sentence than his father, but the primary focus of the trial remained on Joseph. Joseph Kallinger was convicted on multiple counts of murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and robbery. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This sentence reflected not just the severity of his crimes, but also the sadistic cruelty he displayed and the ongoing danger he posed to society. Throughout the trial and sentencing, Joseph's mental state remained a central point of discussion. Expert witnesses testified about his paranoid schizophrenia and how it affected his thinking and behavior. These experts acknowledged that his mental illness was real and severe, but the justice system had to balance mental illness considerations with the need for public safety and justice for victims. Ultimately, accountability won out. For the victims and their families, the conviction brought some measure of relief. Finally, the man who had terrorized them was behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else. But the conviction also reopened painful memories. The trial forced survivors to relive their trauma, to testify about the worst moments of their lives in a public courtroom. And for the families of victims like Linda Mueller, no verdict could bring back their loved ones or undo the pain they'd suffered. The life sentence meant Joseph would spend the rest of his days in prison. And that's exactly what happened. But his story doesn't end with his conviction. Because even behind bars, Joseph Kallinger's violence continued. You might think the prison would be the end of Joseph Kallinger's violent behavior. You would be wrong. His time in prison was marked by repeated acts of violence and self-destructive behavior that made him one of the most difficult and dangerous inmates in the system. His paranoid schizophrenia didn't disappear just because he was incarcerated. The hallucinations continued. The delusions persisted. The voices, including his imaginary companion, Charlie, that disembodied head he conversed with, kept talking to him. And sometimes, those voices told him to do things. One of Joseph's most serious behaviors in prison was setting fires. Fire setting in a prison environment is incredibly dangerous. It can kill not just the person who starts the fire, but also other inmates, guards, and staff who might be trapped. For Joseph, setting fires was often connected to his delusions. He would later claim that Charlie or other voices told him to start the fires. These incidents caused chaos and fear, forcing prison guards to evacuate areas and scramble to extinguish flames before they spread. But fire setting wasn't his only violent behavior. Joseph was involved in numerous physical assaults while incarcerated. His paranoid schizophrenia made him deeply suspicious of those around him. He often believed that other people were plotting to harm him. So he would strike first, attacking in what he perceived as self-defense. He assaulted other inmates. He attacked prison guards. He even fashioned weapons from everyday prison objects, sharpened pieces of metal turned into makeshift knives. These attacks were unpredictable and dangerous, making Joseph a high-risk inmate who required constant monitoring. Prison officials repeatedly placed him in solitary confinement, locked alone in a small cell for extended periods, to protect others from him. But solitary confinement sometimes made his mental health even worse. The isolation intensified his paranoia, increased his feelings of fear and anger, and often led to more violence and self-harm once he was released back into the general population. Joseph's violence wasn't only directed outward, he also engaged in severe self-destructive behavior. He cut himself. He banged his head against walls repeatedly, causing serious injuries. Prison staff would regularly find him with fresh wounds and bruises from these self-inflicted attacks. These acts of self-harm revealed the deep psychological pain and confusion Joseph experienced constantly. He also attempted suicide multiple times during his incarceration. These weren't just cries for attention. They were serious attempts to end his life, driven by severe depression and the hopelessness of his situation. Medical and mental health professionals worked to help Joseph manage his symptoms. He was prescribed antipsychotic medications designed to reduce his hallucinations and delusions. But treatment was complicated. Sometimes Joseph refused to take his medications because his delusions convinced him that he wasn't actually sick, or that the doctors were trying to poison him. His violent behavior made it difficult for medical staff to provide care safely. How do you help someone who might attack you at any moment? Joseph also experienced blackouts and periods of memory loss. Sometimes he wouldn't remember his violent actions at all. This made it even harder for prison officials to understand and manage his behavior. His mental health condition was profoundly unpredictable, causing sudden shifts from apparent calmness to extreme, explosive violence without warning. Joseph Kallinger remained in custody for the rest of his life. And in 1996, at the age of 60, he died while still imprisoned. The exact circumstances of his death haven't been widely publicized, but we know that he passed away behind bars, exactly where the justice system intended him to remain. His death marked the end of a tragic life, and I use that word tragic carefully. Yes, Joseph Kallinger was a monster who committed unspeakable acts. Yes, he tortured and murdered innocent people. Yes, he destroyed lives and caused immeasurable suffering. But his story is still tragic, because we can trace a direct line from the horrifically abused child he was to the violent criminal he became. This doesn't excuse his actions. It doesn't make what he did acceptable or understandable in any moral sense. The victims and their families deserve justice, and they received it. But it does force us to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood trauma, mental illness, and the failures of systems that should protect vulnerable children. Joseph Kallinger's case forces hard questions we still face. How do we treat criminals with severe mental illness, and what duty do we have to protect children from abuse before they become victims or perpetrators? Prisons punish, not heal. Joseph's violent behavior in custody shows how ill-equipped correctional systems are to treat severe psychiatric needs. Michael's story, abused and coerced at 13, reveals the terrifying power of parental influence and the lifelong scars it leaves. This episode explores the cycle of abuse, how trauma and neglect can breed violence, and what it would take to stop it. Want the full, untold details of Michael's fate and what experts uncovered? Download Skoob app now to get access to the full story. If you're affected by abuse, reach out for help. Thanks for listening. Stay safe.